بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك استغيث رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني. Today I'll be speaking about the philosophy of history and the philosophy of history in terms of science, scientific method and scientific development. There are two books I'll be focusing on. First is Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is one of the most, if not the most influential book in recent times when it comes to science. Next is The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood. R.G. Collingwood was a professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford from 1935 to 1941. He's published other books which are The Principles of Art and The Idea of Nature. This book in particular, as well as Kuhn's book, gave me a moment of understanding when I was reading, as I like to call it. What that means is when you're reading something and you come across something that is fascinating, something that has been hidden from us for a very long time, I deemed it upon myself to share it with everyone, and we can discuss this and study this further and understand how science has changed over the years and how science is constantly evolving and constantly changing. The whole idea as well lies between history, so the idea of science and the idea of the development of science. And before we begin, I think it's imperative that we read the introduction of these books, because many of us skip the introduction of books, and I'm guilty of that as well. But I found once you read the introduction of some of these texts, you're able to understand beforehand the preconceived notions, the biases, and also the perspective of the author. Unlike the Quran, which is the untampered word of Allah, books written by human beings and authored and published by human beings by extension are always prone to error and bias. So it's always good to have some base of the author's background. So starting with Collingwood's Idea of History. This book is an essay in the philosophy of history. The name philosophy of history was invented in the 18th century by Voltaire, who meant by it no more than critical or scientific history, a type of historical thinking in which the historian made up his mind for himself instead of repeating whatever stories he found in old books. The same name was used by Hegel and other writers at the end of the 18th century, but they gave it a different sense and regarded it as a meaning simply universal or world history. A third use of the phrase is found in several 19th century positivists, for whom the philosophy of history was the discovery of general laws governing the course of the events which it was history's business to recount. The tasks imposed on the philosophy of history by Voltaire and Hegel could be discharged only by history itself, while the positivists were attempting to make out of history not a philosophy but an empirical science like meteorology. In each of these instances, it was a conception of philosophy which governed the conception of the philosophy of history. For Voltaire, philosophy meant independent and critical thinking. For Hegel, it meant thinking about the world as a whole. For 19th century positivism, it meant the discovery of uniform laws. Now, there's a few things I would like to mention here. 3 points actually. Number one, Voltaire was a French philosopher. At the moment, in the deepest depths of hell, inshallah, he made fun of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He wrote a play called Muhammad, and he's also famous for many quotations. One of them being, "I may disagree with you, but I will fight to the death for your right to comment, for your right to speak about what I may disagree with you on." So this whole idea of freedom of speech and democratizing speech is not real to begin with. But Voltaire, along with Rousseau and Mill and Jeremy Bentham and all the neo, post and peri-Enlightenment thinkers had this in common, although Kant was slightly different in this respect. And then you had the likes of Kierkegaard, who wasn't really an advocate, as far as my reading stretch, of freedom. He was more focused on the existential aspects. So that's number one. Number two, positivists. Who are positivists? I cannot recall exactly, but as far as my knowledge stretches, they were hardcore. What we see, what we can observe is what the world is. That's it. They had no interest in metaphysics. They had no interest in the abstract. Okay, and it was very difficult for them to pinpoint numbers, linguistics, emotions during that time. And if I'm not mistaken, another philosopher who has a very interesting background, which I will highlight at some other point, is A.J. Ayer. He wrote the book Philosophy, Logic and Language, if I'm not mistaken, and he also was a very influential philosopher and logician of his time. So understanding history and the development of the word history, philosophy is extremely important. Third is, as a Muslim, we know already that history in and of itself is evidence for things that occurred and things that will happen and things that are happening right now. Okay. For example, in the Quran, we have the story of many prophets and many messengers. There's so many to choose from. I guess the one I would like to pinpoint at the moment is the story of Yunus alayhi salam, of Prophet Yunus, who in the biblical tradition is known as Jonah, and it's one of his du'as, one of his supplications that I mention at the start of all my videos. And his story goes to show that despite running away, feeling weak and losing courage in that short period, and going through a trial where he was in the darkest place he could possibly be physically and of course mentally, Allah allowed him to redeem himself by preaching and spreading Tawheed, monotheism, of his time to his people. So the idea of history in and of itself does not alter with events, but it's events that alter around history. So, for instance, in the eschatological tradition of Islam, we know that Mahdi alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam will come and defeat the Dajjal, the Antichrist, where it will be essentially monotheists who believe in Allah. So that would be, of course, Muslims and other non-Muslims who will become Muslim at the time, versus the Jews. And the reason it's the Jews because they're a cursed nation forever. Not all Jews, but an overwhelming majority are despicable people. They are individuals who have lost their way many centuries ago, and it's just built in their DNA, despite the worldly success, despite the control. So once you study history, for example, not only World War II, but going a bit back to the Bolshevik massacres and coin clipping and the expulsion from England due to coin clipping and the massacres of these people by the Europeans, and how the Muslims allowed them to be in a quote unquote safe regions, in safe regions, we come to understand that these people do not appreciate Allah, and the fact that they have the Midrash, the Torah, the Talmud, and the Pentateuch, which are the 5 books, and they have so much literature out there that it's no surprise that majority of Jews nowadays are atheists. And it seems like the Muslims are moving in that direction, and it's our job from all angles to explain to people that this is not the way. My use of the term philosophy of history differs from all of these, and in order to explain what I understand by it, I will first say something on my conception of philosophy. So before you can define philosophy of history, we have to understand philosophy in and of itself. Philosophy is far more complicated than it happens to be. It's very easy for us to label any non-fiction book a philosophical book. Even scientific texts can be philosophical. There are many texts that coincide with my area, which is neuroscience. There's, for example, the Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, and another book which I can't remember, which I'm reading at the moment. I think it's Brilliant Fire, Brilliant Air, something like that. Came across it a couple of days ago, so very fascinating to see how at the end of the day, just like history, just like anthropology, just like science, philosophy plays an integral role. So philosophy is reflective. The philosophizing mind never simply thinks about an object. It always, while thinking about any object, thinks about thinks about its own thought about that object. So I'll read that one more time because it's going to do a great job there. The philosophizing mind never simply thinks about an object. It always, while thinking about any object, thinks about its own thought about the object. So it's not thinking about the object, it's thinking about its own thought regarding the object. So that's what Collingwood means by reflective. For example, when one is looking at the massacre and the unaliving of people, the individuals who are trying to justify it, whether it's military contractors and so-called politicians and big banks, for instance, they are deducing if this is moral or amoral based upon their own thoughts regarding that particular event or set of events. Same with an object. How do I know, for example, that the table you're sitting on or the chair you're sitting on is actually a chair but not a shorter version of a table? For example, to discover the distance of the Earth from the Sun is a task thought of the first degree. In this case, for astronomy, to discover what it is exactly that we are doing when we discover the distance of the Earth from the Sun is a task for thought of the second degree. In this instance, for logic or the theory of science. So the example here given by Collingwood is the distance of the Earth from the Sun. Measuring this and discovering the distance, it's essentially one of first degree of astronomy. Astronomy again is a science, okay, of celestial bodies, and to discover what it exactly can come up with in terms of methodologies to discover the distance of the Earth from the Sun. And this is a task for thought of the second degree. So now, first degree is observation, second degree is now thinking about it. And of course, for this you will need logic, science, complex mathematical equations, and potentially machine learning algorithms that can help you deduce the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So hopefully you can see how philosophy and history are slowly coming together here. This is not to say that philosophy is the science of mind or psychology. Psychology is thought of the first degree. It treats mind in just the same way in which biology treats life. And the Quran teaches everything within a human being as the first degree. I'll give you a very quick example. When the Quran speaks about the laws of divorce and the laws of inheritance in chapter 4, that is not a second degree thinking. That's a first degree thinking, because the not antecedent but the prerequisite for us to understand these laws of divorce and inheritance, for example, is justice. I want my equal share. I want the conclusion or the result of case X to be not necessarily in my favor, but be pleasing to Allah and myself. And I get my haqq, which is my right, my moral right, my financial right, so on and so forth. It does not deal with the relation between thought and its object. It deals directly with thought as something quite separate from its object, something that simply happens in the world as a special kind of phenomena, one that can be discussed by itself. For example, schizophrenia. Many claim schizophrenia to be genetic. There is a strong case for that. Schizophrenia, many believe, could be because of chemical imbalances. It's a very lazy and casual way of saying you have a bad diet, and the music you listen to, i.e. the frequencies, and the light and the TV shows you're watching, i.e. what's going in your eyes, is causing this. And I truly believe schizophrenia is because your soul has been tampered with so much external noise and so much external energy that you can't distinguish between yourself and the self that you used to be and the self that you wish to be. Personality disorder also falls into this category. The individual that I used to enjoy studying when it came to personality psychology, and arguably one of the worst human beings to exist, especially in the past few years, Peterson, he had a very interesting aspect on the Big Five personality framework or Big Five model. And yeah, psychology in and of itself tries to understand the phenomena, not looking at the phenomena and giving your own thought. That's to a degree a psychiatrist's job, to understand the subject, the patient, and the object or the set of objects that may be disrupting that particular patient's framework. Philosophy is never concerned with thought by itself. It is always concerned with its relation to its object, and is therefore concerned with the object just as much as with the thought. So now philosophy, according to Collingwood, is playing a dual role here. It's offering an explanation of the object itself, and also an explanation of the thought that is attached with the object, as well as the thought that is detached and free from the object. So, for example, if I say to you right now, don't think of an elephant, you just thought of an elephant, most likely. And the reason you did that is because your brain is wired to the degree where once you comprehend something, it tries to conjure up an image in your mind. And philosophy is trying to explain, at least attempts at explaining, why you thought of an elephant when you were told not to, and why were you thinking in the first place, and why an elephant, and why did your brain not focus on not. This is again linguistics. Folks like Chomsky and Quinn have done a lot of work in this area. I personally am not an expert in neurolinguistics or any philosophy of linguistics, although I am fascinated by this area. It's something that neuroscience tries to explain with models such as Atkinson and Shiffrin, who use memory as a basis for their experiments. Then you have Baddeley's model, And there's many other models within the neuroscience of memory that try and explain linguistics and of course memory. And there's many experiments that utilize learning, thinking, cognition, not in its general sense but more specific, and experiments where it's free of linguistics would be probably Skinner and Pavlov, who were more in the from the behaviorism school of thought, where reinforced learning and punishment enforcement and the reward and punishment aspect of behavior will study heavily just to understand. Again, it's a philosophical thing in the first place before it's psychological. What is reward, what is punishment, and how do we identify them, classify them, define them, and then upon that understand why rats, for example, in Skinner's studies, or dogs in Pavlov's studies, for instance, and now us being these animals in the experiment of AI and smart technology. Why do we conform? Why do we end up building habits in and around these reward, punishment, dopamine spikes, serotonin drops? This distinction between philosophy and psychology may be illustrated in the different attitudes adopted by these disciplines to historical thinking, which is a special kind of thinking concerned with special kind of object, which we will provisionally define as the past. So different attitudes adopted by these disciplines in the past, which is a special kind of thinking according to Collingwood, and for now he's saying that this is what he will refer to as the past, which makes sense. And when we go to Kuhn's introduction, he speaks of something similar regarding past scientists, past philosophers, past thinkers, whose ideas and theories shaped a lot of modern science. However, if they were to be scientists today, and if we were to use today's scientific method on their theories and thinking and methodologies, it would not really be called science, so to speak. So there has been, as Kuhn puts it, a paradigm shift. He was actually one of the first individuals to use this phrase, paradigm shift. And we've certainly seen this with the inoculations over the past 5 years or so. We see this every day with the weight loss, Ozempic, which is akin to poison really. Kidney issues, bone marrow issues, skin issues. But it's being sold. That paradigm has shifted. People are not interested in health benefits, they're interested in time benefits. These days, any product you sell, for example, if it's an AI software, an AI tool, if it's a service or even a product, even a professional service like law or consultancy, you are trying to sell time. You are trying to be efficient in time. You are trying to work around time. USPs, unique selling points might be great, but at the end of the day, you are focusing on time. That's where the paradigm shift is now. A lot of us have to accept, and I'm sure many of us do, that time is flying by, time is moving by. History is by the second. And this is actually a hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that as the hour draws near, time will be faster. Paraphrasing here, but the essential thought here is that as the day of judgment approaches, the day of reckoning, time will accelerate, and it certainly feels that way. Feb 2025 is very hard for me to understand how quick time has gone. And subhanallah, this is only Allah who is in control of space and time without being in space and time. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole Islamic theological arguments. Is Allah free of space and time? Is Allah dependent on space and time? Did He create space and time? If He didn't, then how did it come to be? So what was Allah doing before space and time? All this nonsensical theological debates that were happening between the Maturidis and the Asharis and the Atharis and Mu'tazilis and so on. So the point here essentially is that it's very, very important to understand the thought rather than understand the perspective of the thought in the first place. And this is what the Quran addresses time and time again. The Quran, for example, mentions this in chapter 2, that you always must focus on the goodness and ask for the goodness of this world and the hereafter. Again, this is a dua that I mentioned at the start of my videos. And it's extremely important because despite time going fast, despite business becoming hard, despite the art of sales constantly changing, new technologies we have to adapt to, so on and so forth, you always have to ask for the best and never ever lose hope. The psychologist may entrust himself in historical thinking. He may analyze the peculiar kinds of mental event that go on in historians. He might, for example, argue that historians are people who build up a fantasy world like artists because they are too neurotic to live effectively in the actual world. But unlike artists, project this fantasy world into the past because they connect the origin of their neurosis with past events in their own childhood and always go back and back to the past in a vain attempt to disentangle these neuroses. Instantly what comes to my mind is the filth of Zionism, which is justifying a false text on dominion and imperialistic ambitions to justify the means used and to achieve the end goal. Certainly the case, and as I mentioned previously, there are many situations where, for example, I can easily stand up and say, well, look, I'm going back to Cordoba because my grandmother from about 700-800 years ago, she had a textile business, so that building there is actually mine. It's crazy thought. Anyway, moving forward, this analysis might go into further detail and show how the historian's interest in a commanding figure such as Julius Caesar expresses his childhood attitude to his father and so on. I do not suggest that such analysis is a waste of time. I only describe a typical case of it in order to point out that it concentrates its attention exclusively on the subjective term in the original subject-object relation. The whole psychological analysis of historical thought would be exactly the same if there were no such thing as the past at all. If Julius Caesar were an imaginary character and if history were not knowledge but pure fancy. So what Collingwood is saying is that even if history of a particular person, in this case Julius Caesar, did not exist, the psychological analysis of historical thought would be the same. And he says this is due to the subjectiveness of subject-object relationship, which makes sense. I see his point here. For the philosopher, the fact demanding attention is neither for the past by itself, as it is for the historian, nor the historian thought about it by itself, as it is for the psychologist, but two things in their mutual relation. Thought in its relation to its object is not mere thought, but knowledge. You see, this is interesting because from a neuroscience point of view, knowledge is not exactly considered as it's conventionally believed to be. For example, knowledge is so hard to define, and many do not agree. But the way I would define knowledge is in the following way. It's a two-part definition, because you have acquired knowledge and then you have revealed knowledge. Acquired knowledge is what I would say comes under the bracket of cognition. So knowledge is information that has been deduced, interpreted by our senses, and allows us to navigate, understand, and also accept the reality we're in. That's acquired knowledge. Revealed knowledge is the Quran and the Sunnah and the Ahadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is again information that has been processed. In terms of the Quran, information that has been processed by the subject regarding the object, the world around us, and allowing us to ponder and think about what has been said. It's very impossible, in fact, it's not even very, it's absolutely impossible for you to work upon something that you do not understand. This is very, very obvious, but not at the same time. For example, many Muslims do not pray, although it's mentioned clearly in chapter 30 that the difference between those who do pray and don't pray is being classified as a mushrik, as an idol worshipper, someone who associates partners with Allah, which is the opposite of Tawheed, which is shirk. Tawheed, oneness, monotheism; shirk, associating partners. For example, concept of Trinity. You also have other concepts of such as pantheism. Apart from pantheism, you have polytheism. There's another one I'm trying to think of. Humanism as well, where you take Allah out of the equation and you just accept everything He's revealed over the course of human history. So it's very, very important that we understand what knowledge is. Knowledge is not something that you know. Knowledge is something that you've processed. You've taken the energy and time out to reflect. This is why companies today take advantage of your God-given, your Allah-given ability to process information and convert it into knowledge. And what they've done is flipped it on its head, where they feed you the information they want you to know via algorithms, and again selling you the concept of time, whereby instead of reading such a big book on the philosophy of history, one would expect to simply watch a 45-second, maybe to about a 2-minute short video on the concept of the philosophy of history, or any other concept, right? Could be a DIY video, tutorial, so on and so forth. So again, the paradigm shift from knowledge from less than 100 years ago, when this book was written, and till now is huge. But what's unchanged is the processing of information into knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of course, you have deviant groups and sects within Islam, and that's why Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hadith mentions that till Yawm al-Qiyamah there will be one group, not one sect, but one group that will remain on the haqq, will remain on the truth. And if we look at the hadith of Ghadir Khum, and Khum was a name of a town or village or an area. I can't remember exactly, but it's an area in the Arabian Peninsula. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave a khutbah, gave a sermon there, saying that hold on to the rope of Allah and also follow and keep guard and protect my Ahlul Bayt. Ahlul Bayt are the individuals who are part of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's household, which includes Ali alayhi salam, Hassan, Hussein, and Fatima salamu alayha, and also his wives. But it's more to the blood relatives rather than those relations that entered Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's house through marriage. So the fact of the matter is that there will always be a group of critical thinkers, no matter how hard the criminal social media companies will try and deceive us. We've all been a victim of scrolling for hours and hours, and it's only natural that you take a step back and you reflect on what's going on, right? So going back to what Collingwood said, thought in its relation to its object is not mere thought but knowledge. Thus, what is for psychology the theory of mere thoughts of mental events in abstraction from any object is for philosophy the theory of knowledge. So psychology is trying to explain the thoughts of mental events in abstraction from any object. For example, you've been through a traumatic incident, but trauma is something you can't simply put under a microscope. It has to be studied. You have to go through particular steps. One of the most common methodologies is CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and how they try and backtrack and break each portion of your thoughts that lead up to the recurring thought of trauma. For example, it could be a trigger, it could be a sound, it could be a color, it could be many things. Agoraphobics, I believe, are people who are scared of elevators, and you have people who have irrational fear of water, so on and so forth. So backtracking. And philosophy is a theory of knowledge. So why do we know what we know? Where the psychologist asks himself, how do historians think? The philosophers ask himself, how do historians know? Thinking, thought, knowing, explaining that thought. How do they come to comprehend the past? Conversely, it is the historian's business, not the philosopher's, to apprehend the past as a thing in itself, to say, for example, that so many years ago such and such events happened. The philosopher is concerned with these events not as things in themselves, but as things known to the historian, and to ask what kind of events they were and when and where they took place, but what it is about them that makes it possible for historians to know them. So Collingwood is saying that the philosopher's role here is essentially concerned with the events, not the things within the events. For example, if I'm studying the Battle of Yarmouk, when the Muslims defeated the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, and I'm not studying the art of armory or the weapons that the Muslims fought with, or the type of artillery the Byzantines had at the time. What I'm interested in is the leadership of Umar alayhi salam and the tactical genius of Khalid ibn Walid and his personality, and understanding also Abdullah ibn Jarrah, Ubaidullah ibn Jarrah, and understand how the companions at the time managed to come together and have this strategy. So again, it's not the weapons and the horses I'm interested in. I'm interested in the thought process behind how they managed to defeat such a powerful enemy. and what makes it possible to historians to think about these events. Again, I can show you, for example, a relic from the time the Belgians took over Congo, and many of them exist in the world. You cannot exactly know the mentality behind Leopold and why he massacred millions and millions of Congolese, and what was the thought process behind the Congolese individuals, men, women, and children who were enslaved by the Belgians for such a long time. Their skin was peeled off and mixed with rubber to make tires. Goodyear, for example, a company that still exists, right? How they managed to do such heinous crimes, and the thought process behind that. And how do we know that their thought process was such and such, is what Collingwood is saying. The Ghost of Leopold is an interesting book. I highly recommend everyone reads that, because everyone speaks about, the World War II incidents that happened and World War One. No one ever really speaks about this, and I would just like to say here, inshallah, Palestine, Congo, Sudan, Xinjiang, and everywhere in the world, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Syria, Masr, everywhere where Muslims are suffering, may Allah ease their burden, and may Allah make it a situation where they are able to comprehend and reach the highest ranks of Jannah, and Allah forgive them. Ameen. So, thus the philosopher has to think about the historian's mind. But in doing so, he is not duplicating the work of the psychologist. For to him, the historian's thought is not a complex of mental phenomena, but a system of knowledge. He also thinks about the past, but not in such a way as to duplicate the work of the historian, for the past to him is not a series of events, but a system of things known. One might put this by saying that the philosopher, in so far as he thinks about the subjective side of history, is an epistemologist, and so far as he thinks about the objective side, a metaphysician. But that way of putting it would be dangerous, as conveying a suggestion that the epistemological and metaphysical parts of his work can be treated separately, and this would be a mistake. Philosophy cannot separate the study of knowing from the study of what is known. This impossibility follows directly from the idea of philosophy as thought of the second degree. So thought, first degree, philosophy of thought, second degree. Why we know what we think about. As I mentioned, why we know what we know. And Collingwood essentially is trying to narrow down and compartmentalize the role of a philosopher when it comes to history. And when you, for example, look back on your own life, are you looking at your past as the past, or are you looking at the events that happened as something you wished happened or did not happen? Because, for example, the historian would love not event X, Y, and Z to happen because of some inherent cultural bias or some religious bias, but the fact that it's happened, and the fact that the like or dislike aspect is to be put to the side and an objective stance has to be taken. That's where the concept of presence of mind comes into play. And presence of mind is the idea that you are present right now and you're looking to understand, okay, what happened then has led me to this point. How do I from this point move forward in the direction that I desire? And as the Quran mentions, Allah is the best of all planners, such as in the story of Isa alayhi salam, when they attempted to kill him and injured him, and Allah raised him to the heavens. Allah says, the Quran says Allah is the best of all planets. So this idea of separating of knowing and what is known is impossible, right? And if this is the general character of philosophical thinking, what do I mean when I qualify the term philosophy by adding of history? In what sense is there a special philosophy of history different from philosophy in general and from the philosophy of anything else? Well, it is generally, though somewhat precariously, agreed that there are distinctions within the body of philosophy. Most people distinguish logic or the theory of knowledge from the ethics or the theory of action, although most of those who make the distinction would also agree that knowing is in some sense a kind of action, and that action as it is studied by ethics is, or at least involves, certain kinds of knowing. The thought which the logician studies is a thought which aims at the discovery of truth. Let me repeat that, that's very profound. The thought which the logician studies is a thought which aims at the discovery of truth, and is thus an example of activity directed towards an end, and these are ethical conceptions. Now, the logician studies and tries to discover the truth. What does that mean? Well, when you read the Quran actually challenges the reader to produce something like a verse, a chapter. And the fact that many have attempted at disqualifying and disproving the Quran have failed. All have failed, and few of them have accepted Islam. And there are many examples of individuals who went out to disprove the Quran and end up accepting the message. And what Collingwood here is saying, that action in and of itself is not just something where it's physical, but it's actually a case where it's a certain kind of knowing. But from an Islamic point of view, it all starts with intention. Intention is also a kind of knowing. I think, therefore I am. Classic Descartes line. I don't entirely agree with I think, therefore I am. The idea is that I exist, therefore I am. Because I'll use an Avicennian argument here that one cannot deny existence. That's the first premise of his argument of proving the cosmos and proving the existence of Allah back in those times. And it's a very metaphysical point, but just to keep it brief here, I exist, therefore I am. The fact that I know I exist, therefore I can intend to either keep existing or not existing. And in order for me to exist, I need to eat food. Therefore, I intend to go out and eat. But hang on a second, I don't have money. Okay, I need to now work. But wait, I don't have the skills. Let me get the skills. So the intention eventually leads to a motivated thought that eventually leads to the action, and the action leads to an outcome. And the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam pinpoints this every step of the way. A hadith I like to mention here is that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions that Allah is not interested in your face and your wealth. He's interested with your intention and what's in your heart. And that's the thing. How can you use abstract conditions, number one, and number two, abstract processes which pertain to those conditions, right? And once those conditions, along with the process lead up to an action, ethical or not, moral or not, that's besides the point here. How can each stage be qualified where it's universally recognized, acceptable, and is unable to be altered? So for example, abstract condition, do not steal. Abstract process, I'm not going to steal if I see someone's suitcase open at the airport and they just gone to the side to ask someone if they can get on the next flight, and I can see the suitcase in the lobby and I can see some nice pair of shoes or a watch or a laptop or something, and then the action of walking away where clearly there was a gain for me, but the gain would have been unethical and the entire process is immoral essentially. And how do I justify it being moral or immoral, ethical or unethical? For that you need an objective framework, and this is where, irrespective of where someone studied, non-Muslims cannot give us an objective guideline that is true, past, present and future, that will allow, for example, a king to stand behind a knight or stand behind a peasant, speaking in medieval terms here, and allow the peasant to lead the prayer and allow the peasant to give advice to the knight, ethical advice, and allowing the knight to then discuss something with his superior, so-called superior, the king, about morality. So we see this in the Christian tradition, actually, if I'm not mistaken, where heretics were highlighted by early church characters, and as far as my memory stretches, Tertullian touches on this aspect in one of his essays on heretics and how to deal with them. And again, looking at that, applying everything Collingwood has spoken about so far, I'm not interested in what Tertullian ate or where he lived or who he was speaking to in terms of their SES, their socio-economic status. What I'm interested in is how did he know at the time, and how do I know what he knew in this time in order for me to make a value judgment. So this is in and of itself what philosophy tries to do when it comes to analyzing history. The action which the moral philosopher studies is an action based on knowledge or belief as to what is right or wrong. And knowledge or belief is an epistemological conception. Knowledge or belief is an epistemological conception. Thus, logic and ethics are connected and indeed inseparable, although they are distinct. If there is a philosophy of history, it will be no less intimately connected with the other special philosophical sciences than these two are connected with each other. We then have to ask why the philosopher of history should be a subject of special study instead of being merged in a general theory of knowledge. Throughout the course of European civilization, people have in some degree thought historically, but we seldom reflect on the activities which we perform quite easily. It is only the difficulties which we encounter that force upon us a consciousness of our own efforts to overcome them. Thus, the subject matter of philosophy as the organized and scientific development of self-consciousness depends from time to time on the special problems at which any given time men find special difficulties. Now he's saying it's temporal to a degree, dependent on time. By time, I mean age, the age you're living in. To look at the topics especially prominent in the philosophy of any given people at any given period of their history is to find an indication of the special problems which they feel to be calling forth the whole energies of their minds. The peripheral or subsidiary topics will reveal the things about which they feel no special difficulty. So, secondary subjects, secondary topics will reveal something that wasn't really of difficulty in a special sense, meaning this is very difficult. How do I come across it? Is what Collingwood is saying. And what he means by this is that once a particular problem is indicated from the past, right, this in and of itself is a problem that has been a result of the culmination of many minds. And when you understand that problem in history and you find a secondary issue, they do not feel as difficult to understand as the first one. So, for example, if we were to look at the Battle of Karbala, yeah, and the way Hussein alayhi salam was brutally martyred and assassinated, and the companions who commented on him once his head was brought in a dish, and during that difficult moment, it's not difficult to understand why certain companions thought, oh, well, this is a great thing, and why some companions thought, no, this is the worst thing. And there's much more to this. This is entire thesis. But the bigger problem now is the Sunni Shia divide that exists now. And it's a massive crack. It's a big divide that is slowly taking its time to fill. And ideally, it will be the case where the Sunnis and Shias come together, because Imam Mahdi alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam, they're not going to be Sunni or Shia. They're going to be following the Quran and the Sunnah. So that is something we have to think about. So that's what I gathered from what Collingwood just mentioned here. So now our philosophical tradition goes back in a continuous line to 6th century Greece. And at that time, the special problem of thought was the task of laying the foundation of mathematics. Greek philosophy therefore placed mathematics in the center of its picture. And when it discussed the theory of knowledge, it understood by it first and foremost the theory of mathematical knowledge. Euclidean shapes, for example. Euclidean shapes is what, for instance, folks like scientists such as Ibn Haytham and Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Kindi used. And they didn't utilize knowledge of mathematics per se. What they utilized was the theory of mathematical knowledge. So what's the difference here? Knowledge of mathematics. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, great. But now the mathematical knowledge behind 2 plus 2 being 4, that will eventually lead you to abstractions, and that's what mathematics is essentially. It's abstract philosophical assumptions that are predicated on type of truth. Okay, and these assumptions lead us to logical conclusions. And very recently, Terence Howard speaking about 1 times 1 is 2, can't be 1. Mathematics is not my field per se, but I can see the argument being made here by Collingwood in terms of understanding first and foremost the theory of mathematical knowledge. So since then, there have been, down to a century ago, 2 great constructive ages of European history. In the Middle Ages, the central problems of thought were concerned with theology, and the problems of philosophy therefore arose out of reflection on theology and were concerned with the relations of God and man. So when he speaks of Middle Ages, by the way, this was what many categorize as the golden age of Islam, of Muslims. The golden age of Muslims. And during the Middle Ages, you had characters like Ibn Sina, as I mentioned earlier, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Pace, and Ibn Rushd had a massive impact on Middle Age thinkers such as St. Thomas Aquinas, most famous for his work Summa Theologica. Some things do exist in his writings where Aquinas certainly takes ideas from Muslims. One of them being that ultimate happiness for man does not exist in this world. It's impossible. Again, the example I gave using Collingwood's breakdown and analysis of philosophy and history. Again, I'm not concerned with what Thomas Aquinas ate, who he met necessarily. What I am interested in is what he knew and understanding what he knew and how he knew, and certainly how he was able to draw everything together and put forward his own idea. And in other words, understanding the knowledge he had and how it was applicable in his time and in today's time. So from the 16th to the 19th centuries, the main effort of thought was concerned with laying the foundations of natural science, and philosophy took as its main theme the relation of the human mind as subject to the natural world of things around in its space as object. Sounds like a typo here. Philosophy took as its main theme the relation of the human mind as subject to the natural world of things around it in space as object. So the space is object and the human mind is the subject. Okay, so subject-object relation here. So the human mind in relation to space. Okay. All this time, of course, people were also thinking historically, but their historical thought was always of a comparatively simple or even rudimentary kind. Rudimentary means elementary or not massive or significant. It raised no problems which it did not find easy to solve, and was never forced to reflect upon itself. But in the 18th century, people began thinking critically about history, as they had already learnt to think critically about the external world, because history began to be regarded as a special form of thought, not quite like mathematics or theology or science. So, to a degree that is true, history can be a type of science. For example, if you look at the ahadith and how they are classified from strong hadith to daif. Daif hadith is a weak hadith. So it doesn't mean it's fabricated or made up. It just means the chain of transmission is weak. Someone in the chain was either not praying in the mosque, maybe they were dishonest, maybe they went to a place where they shouldn't, so on and so forth. So how, for example, do I know? And this is where a lot of us have to really work hard, because there's this new group of Quranists on the scene, which is just nonsense in the most simplest and kindest words I can say. It's just complete nonsense. Ibn Kathir has written a book on this, which I myself am studying. And one of the most fascinating categories I came across, which I did not before, which was a shadh hadith. And I don't want to say what that is right now because I came across it literally less than 24 hours ago. And as far as my knowledge stretches, hadith is sahih, that's the strongest, and then you have hasan, which is a bit less strong than that. And the idea here is that the sahih hadith lay the foundations for all the actions that we must adhere to that are not mentioned in the Quran. For example, and I don't know why this is controversial, which is how to pray. So in the Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, we have a hadith of how Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to pray, and one of the methods of praying was when he was in ruku. So that's when your legs are straight and you bow down. Okay, he would get up and do rafa yadayn, so raising the hands. Okay, and then go into sujood, and then get back up, and then after this posture here, you do that again for the second circuit. So we look at the hadith and we understand and study also aspects of how to clean ourselves, how to travel. By how to travel, I mean the laws and regulations that pertains and adheres to traveling. And one of them is, for instance, the fact that you can cut your compulsory prayers, decrease your compulsory prayers by 50%. So these are the 2 afternoon and the 1 evening prayer. From 4 units, you then break them down into 2 because you're a traveler for less than 2 weeks. So understanding the relationship of history and the procedures that exist because of history, because hadith is history, so is the Quran. But the science here is, as I mentioned, the Ibn Kathir book and the different relations and categories of hadith. It's an entire science. You have to step into it and understand each transmitter, understand the first 3 generations after Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how they were able to keep that information watertight, precise and accurate, so that individuals such as Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, who wrote and compiled Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim respectively, were able to keep the information accurate. And subhanallah, this is just one of the many wonders of Islam, where information and knowledge is so revered and it's so precious that many of us, at times, including myself, we take for granted. Think of it this way: the moment you lose your eyes, you lose your hearing, you lose your ability to speak, your ability to produce speech, memory issues, right? Motor issues, so on and so forth. One would definitely regret not taking knowledge seriously, and this is why I do these particular series of videos as much as I possibly can, despite going through some great times and challenging times in my life, alhamdulillah. Anyway, the result of this reflection was that a theory of knowledge proceeding on the assumption that mathematics or theology or science or all three together could exhaust the problems of knowledge in general was no longer satisfactory. So now Collingwood is talking about the period of enlightenment, where natural science, as purported by folks like Hume and Descartes and Kant, although Kant did comment on the existence of God, and I don't know why this exists, and if anyone can point me in the right direction, the fact that on one of Kant's thesis papers, it says Bismillah Rahman Rahim in Arabic. Did he write that? Was that put there afterwards? I don't know. But there seems to be an influence, of course, of the Islamic golden age upon Enlightenment thinkers, and very recently I've stepped into this area of philosophy, where, for example, Kant, Aristotle, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina are discussing more or less similar ideas, because Greek philosophy did have a major influence. That's why so many issues arose during that time. Anyway, historical thought has an object with peculiarities. Okay, historical thought has an object with peculiarities of its own. The past consisting of particular events in space and time which are no longer happening cannot be apprehended by mathematical thinking, because mathematical thinking apprehends objects that have no special location in space and time, and it is just the lack of peculiar spatio-temporal location that makes them knowable. So, for example, 2 plus 2 equals to 4 is not dependent on that statement being made in London or Barcelona or Rome or Cairo or Islamabad or anywhere. That is free of space and time because it's abstract, right? However, history, depends and is very much aligned with space and time. Without space and time, you can't really understand history. If I talk about Greeks, instantly you're going to think about the area of Greece and how, for example, the period during the Peloponnesian Wars, if that's an area an historian is looking at, for example, you need space and time. It's very obvious. Nor can the past be apprehended by theological thinking, because the object of that kind of thinking is a single infinite object, and historical events are finite in plural. So, yeah, theology is a study of God, and the study of God, which is from a philosophical point of view, it's a science that tries to, for example, explain the existence of God, the ethics that is related to religion and the laws of religion, and the aspects and attributes of God: omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing, all merciful, all gracious, so on and so forth. I've kind of touched on this earlier in the video, how early Muslim theologians tried to reconcile these aspects, which, to be fair, back then, I guess it made sense because everyone was having a good time. Muslims were at their peak, but now that is something that we should not really be discussing in and of itself. It's nice to know. It's nice to know as a specialist subject, but as far as I'm concerned, Isa alayhi salam and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, neither of them are Ashari or Athari or Maturidi or Mu'tazili or this ism or that schism, really and truly. Yeah, sure, you can get some interesting aspects from these theories. You can certainly use induction to come to a general consensus, but it's not something that will affect my hereafter, because what will affect is the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, the Quran will be a witness for or against you. So I'll let you think about that. Nor by scientific thinking, because the truths which science discovers are known to be true by being found through observation and experiment, exemplified in what we actually perceive, whereas the past has vanished and our ideas about it can never be verified as we verify our scientific hypotheses. So the past is gone. Scientific thinking depends on constantly redoing the experiments and seeing any varying results. For example, the scientific method, it's widely attributed to Ibn Haytham, who came up with observation and then experimentation and then coming up with the conclusion and then essentially testing your hypothesis, forming a theory. That theory eventually becomes a scientific law, but again, it's still subject to change. And again, that is something that Kuhn speaks about, which we will touch on in terms of scientific changes in the paradigms. So, theories of knowledge designed to account for mathematical and theological and scientific knowledge thus do not touch on the special problems of historical knowledge, and if they offer themselves as complete accounts of knowledge, they actually imply that historical knowledge is impossible. Okay, what does that mean? Theories of knowledge designed to account for mathematical and theological and scientific knowledge thus do not match the special problems of historical knowledge. Whether I use mathematics, theology, or scientific knowledge, I cannot really understand how the Muslims took over the Sassanids and the Byzantines. It's impossible, really. And if they offer themselves as complete accounts of knowledge, they actually imply that historical knowledge is impossible. Yeah, so historical knowledge doesn't really fit into the methodology where you would probably start with mathematics, or in fact you probably start with theology and then couple it with mathematics, and right after that use scientific knowledge. Either way, it's very hard for the historical knowledge to give us a concrete conclusion that actually agrees with the historical. So for example, I can't use 2 plus 2 is 4. I can't use that along with, for example, Allah is one. There's no such thing as the Trinity. That's complete nonsense. And there's no such thing as the scientific knowledge that, for example, acid and alkaline, there's a difference between their properties. This will not allow me to understand how Muslims were able to conquer superpowers of their time, for example. I need historical data and knowledge and methodologies to come to that conclusion, or a conclusion. Hopefully that makes sense. This did not matter so long as historical knowledge had not yet obtruded itself on the consciousness of philosophers by encountering special difficulties and devising a special technique to meet them. So historical knowledge did not matter, apparently, up until the point that historical knowledge did not obtrude. Obtrude means to impose and force your way in a very unwelcoming manner. So for example, the way the colonizer would enter into its subjects' lands, that is a case where it's not only obstructing the rights of the people, but it's obtruded itself, or if it's colonizers themselves, into that land, into that area, into that territory that's not theirs to begin with. But when that happened, as it did, roughly speaking, in the 19th century, so 19th century is when they realized, hey, you know what, historical knowledge, we need that. Subhanallah. The situation was that current theories of knowledge were directed towards special problems of science and inherited a tradition based on study of mathematics and theology, where this new historical technique, growing up on all sides, was accounted for. A special inquiry was therefore needed, whose task should be the study of this new problem or group of problems, the philosophical problems created by the existence of organized and systemized historical research. This new inquiry might justly claim the title philosophy of history, and it is to this inquiry that this book is a contribution. Now, the reason I actually picked this topic up was because, you know, the concept of ahadith is so dense, it's so rich, that it's very important to understand history from a philosophical point of view. And what Collingwood has said so far, most of it does make sense, and I don't see any issues at this point. Whether it's the changes, the growth, or the development of historical knowledge, and even the political historical knowledge as well. So far, it's interesting how he has broken down these aspects. So inshallah, yeah. So I'm gonna touch on a couple of more sections because everything else is just a brief breakdown of the different parts and chapters in the book, and that will only make sense once I read and break them down for us, right? And inshallah, as time goes on, we will certainly do that. Right, so 2 stages are to be expected as this inquiry proceeds. First, the philosophy of history will have to be worked out, not indeed in a watertight compartment, for there are none in philosophy, but in a relatively isolated condition regarded as a special study of a special problem. Kind of similar to what I mentioned earlier when it's in regards to Islamic theological debates of the Islamic Golden Age, and the fact that there is no watertight aspect of philosophical inquiry, although the Quran is the complete opposite of this. Subhanallah. As soon as I said there's no issues with his work, just now this is the first issue that's been highlighted right in front of me. And if it's not a watertight, if there is no watertight element, so watertight meaning there's no room for movement and changes, right? It's stuck, it's airtight, watertight, whatever fluid you want to think of. The Quran is exactly the opposite. It's watertight, it's airtight. In fact, it's infinitely tight, right? Again, this was a big debate many centuries ago. Is the Quran the created word of God, or is this Allah's speech which Allah created? Did Allah create his own speech, or was his speech in existence with him? So that is very problematic, because now you're basically challenging the attributes of Allah, number one, and number two, you're trying to not entirely but partly redefine the linguistic miracle of the Quran, and also the ability of the language of Arabic to be preserved and be learned by everyone, right? And even the Quran states where Allah says that He intentionally revealed the Quran in Arabic, because there is a very special, potent in terms of extremely powerful aspects of the linguistic miracle and the linguistic mechanisms of the Arabic language, which cannot be found in Latin or English or French or Spanish or Romanian or Greek or Assyrian or any other Hebrew or any other Semitic languages even. It doesn't exist. The problem requires special treatment just because the traditional philosophers do not deal with it. And it requires to be isolated because it is a general rule that what a philosophy does not assert, it denies. Right. So if a philosophy does not assert, it denies it. So that the traditional philosophers carry with them the implication that historical knowledge is impossible. The philosophy of history has therefore to leave them alone until it can build up an independent demonstration of how history is possible. So what's being said here is that, firstly, the watertight aspect doesn't exist in philosophy, because when you treat it as an isolated condition, it cannot be completely free from errors, right? The problem requires special treatment because traditional philosophies do not deal with historical knowledge, is what Collingwood is saying, and it requires to be isolated because it is a general rule that what a philosophy does not assert, it denies, so that the traditional philosophies carry with them the implication that historical knowledge is impossible. The philosophy of history has therefore to leave them alone until it can build up an independent demonstration of how history is possible. So you have to understand that Collingwood was writing at a time where philosophy of historical knowledge, philosophy of history, was not very mainstream. It was not widely studied. People were not entirely interested in the philosophy of history. In fact, people were interested in the aspects of philosophy in and of itself, in regards to theology, in regards to scientific knowledge, and to a large degree as well, mathematics. We see this to be the case now. In fact, a fascinating book I've read, one of the most fascinating books I've ever read actually, is by Rupert Sheldrake, called The Science Delusion. And he also speaks about the philosophical underpinnings of scientific research, scientific knowledge, and scientific development. And again, this is what Kuhn also mentions here. So inshallah, once I conclude Collingwood's introduction, we will jump on to Kuhn, most likely in the second part of this video, because just like this particular video, it requires a comprehensive explanation, and my goal here is to explain things not only to myself but also to you in lucid language, so it's very easy to flow in your mind and easy to comprehend, because these are aspects that are so important, especially if you're looking to homeschool your children. And if you have children, you must be homeschooling them in the areas of philosophy, science, logic, and religion, Islam, but also teach them theology and other aspects of comparative religion. Extremely important. Then you can touch on atheism. The problem is that many want to jump into philosophy because it's attractive and it's different and it's a bit edgy, and then once they jump into it, they become extremely confused whether they are Muslim or Christian or Jewish or this or that. It becomes extremely difficult for them to come to terms with their own religion, their own biases, and their own ulterior motives they had to approach religion pre and post philosophy. So an example I can give of what I'm trying to point out is that I remember back in the day when I started reading Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche, I was like, wow, this is amazing, this guy's so deep. He's talking about existentialism and how, for example, God is nowhere to be seen and there's so much chaos, and is there really any point, and why do we exist, should we exist, is there any point, so on and so forth. So though Nietzsche was more or less a reaction to Schopenhauer and all these other odd, weird characters, won't be surprised if any of them were PDF files, to be fair, because Nietzsche did reportedly die from syphilis, so it's no surprise there. Once I read that, I found it extremely difficult to get up and do wudu and pray. I was like, oh, there's no point really. This guy, this German guy, so smart, so excellent with his words. And then I realized about a few years later, I was like, hang on a second. This guy died of syphilis, wrote all these books, and he's being studied. Okay, great, fair enough. But how many people actually praise him in a genuine sense, not because he supports their atheistic, godless perspectives and thoughts, but how many actually approve of him? How many revere him? How many people have named their child Frederick or named their child Nietzsche after Friedrich Nietzsche, for example? Our question was basically no one. However, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to this very second, until the last second of this material earth, this material reality, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will constantly be praised. In fact, Allah mentions in the Quran that his name will be constantly raised and raised and raised. Name being raised as in being praised, being mentioned, and salawat being sent upon him. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So, okay, interesting. The second stage will be to work out the connections between this new branch of philosophy and the old traditional doctrines. Any addition to the body of philosophical ideas alters to some extent everything that was there already. Yeah, so this is, again, this is what Kuhn speaks of, that science in and of itself, if previously science was XYZ criterion, right? XYZ, if X is taken out, then science is no longer science. Science is simply something you can play around with. It's not adherent, it's not watertight. However, with the XYZ criterion, here the assumption is, let's say, T1 in a particular moment in time. If XYZ cannot be altered, cannot be moved, then that may or may not be science, but there is certainly a particular law that has been glued and gelled with this XYZ paradigm in T1. However, what's happened is, as we move to T2, so let's say 1925, 2025, T1, T2. In T2, we see that the scientific method has changed drastically. In fact, artificial intelligence is playing a huge role. Machine learning, generally speaking, has changed the game to a large degree, right? And this shift in paradigm from 1925 to 2025 in 100 years is huge. It's a big deal. And the question that Kuhn poses, and this is what Collingwood is saying here, Kuhn means from a science point of view that is that really science? And Collingwood is saying that is that really philosophy, where you can add and subtract and alter it? Any addition to the body of philosophical ideas alters to some extent everything that was there already, and the establishment of a new philosophical science necessitates a revision of all the old ones. For example, the establishment of modern natural science and of the philosophical theory produced by reflection upon it reacted upon the established logic by producing widespread discontent with the syllogistic logic and substituting for it the new methodologies of Descartes and Bacon, Francis Bacon. The same thing reacted upon the theological metaphysics which the 17th century had inherited from the Middle Ages and produced the new conceptions of God, which we find, for example, in Descartes and Spinoza. Benedict Spinoza, I believe he was a Jew. Spinoza's God is the God of medieval theology as was revised in the light of 17th century science. So Spinoza used theology to justify scientific knowledge and philosophy of his time. Thus, by the time of Spinoza, the philosophy of science was no longer a particular branch of philosophical investigation, separate from the rest. It had permeated all the rest and produced a complete philosophy, all conceived in a scientific spirit. So this is much like Darwinism and Neo-Darwinism, actually, where philosophy of science has been changed and altered so much that now it's literally a religion. Atheism is a religion. It's not it's not like mesotheism where mesotheism where it's the hatred of God. Rather, it's a paradigm shift where science has now become scientism, which is a type of religion now, right? And this actually was seen in the time of Spinoza. I believe I have a book by Spinoza called Ethics, one of the most difficult books I've read actually. I read a few pages, and this was back in 2021, and I didn't really have a chance to get back to Spinoza. But yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, the Muslim influence is quite vast, but many thinkers back in the 19th and 20th century were not interested in discussing this at the time. Anyway, in the present case, this will mean a general overhauling of all philosophical questions in the light of the results reached by the philosophy of history in the narrower sense. Narrower sense, and this will produce a new philosophy, which will be a philosophy of history in the wide sense, i.e. a complete philosophy conceived from a historical point of view. Okay, of these two stages, we must be content if this book represents the first. So this is what Collingwood is now summarizing. What I am attempting here is a philosophical inquiry into the nature of history regarded as a special type or form of knowledge with a special type of object, leaving aside for the present the further question how the inquiry will affect other departments of philosophical study. So how will historical knowledge and the philosophy of history affect other aspects of philosophical study? Question is, it will, and it has, because the philosophy of science, the philosophy of ethics, and the philosophy of rhetoric, language, and even art. Interestingly, Kant, in his book The Critique of Judgment, speaks about art in a very unique way, which I liked, saying that art, in the most simplest terms, he said that art is something that comes naturally. It's not imitation. I cannot say this is art because it has been imitated by another piece of art. That is an imitation, but what art is something unique, but still it's very subjective. For example, if we were to see the magnificent mosques around the world, we see them as works of art, of grandeur, architecture. However, if the same mosque was to be reconstructed today in another location, let's say the Badshah Mosque in Lahore, Pakistan, was to be reconstructed in Munich, in Germany, that's not really art, that's imitation. However, a portrait of a man with the Badshah Mosque behind him, that portrait is art. But if the same man was in Munich with, let's say, the Bayern Munich stadium behind him, that is also art. So now the question is the subject-object relationship here. This is what Kant is trying to say. And in terms of the historical aspect as well, maybe 300, 400, 500 years from now, Bayern Munich Stadium will be considered art. Although most buildings today are so ugly, they all look the same. There's nothing different. All stadiums look more or less the same. And countries had a unique look. Egypt has a unique look, but if you look at New Cairo, it's just like another Dubai, Las Vegas, London type situation going on. London had a unique look, and Rome had a unique look, Barcelona had a unique look, Munich had a unique look, Copenhagen had a unique look. So many cities I can name, and they all more or less look the same. These boring, dull, black rock, vanguard, Zionistic, imperialistic architecture is just incredible. Incredible in a good sense, because a lot of commerce and opportunity and business is being done. However, the evil outweighs the good here, because at the exploiting Congolese children for batteries, for example, and the amount of deception that goes into manipulating laws and lobbying politicians. How will history look at this? Right? So now coming to the second section here, which is history's nature, object, method, and value. What history is, what is it about, how it proceeds, and what is it for, are questions to some extent different people would answer in different ways, but in spite of differences, there is a large measure of agreement between the answers. And this agreement becomes closer if the answers are subjected to scrutiny with a view to discarding those which proceed from unqualified witnesses. This may sound familiar for those who are familiar with hadith and what I mentioned also earlier, that you have to scrutinize and really examine, for example, the transmitters of hadith, the Sahabi, the Tabi, and the Tabi'un, and see how these individuals were they truthful? Did they pray 5 times in the mosque? Did they avoid any haram, forbidden activities? Were they of good character? Were they trustworthy? Were they knowledgeable, or were they just surface level basic knowledge Muslims? Although most of them weren't, they were the top of the top, of course. And so this is what Collingwood is saying, is that despite the differences in how history, the differences in perspective that people may have in terms of what history is, what's it about, how it proceeds, how it's developed, and what it tries to question from different people, you would expect different answers, of course. And that's why it's important that despite these differences, there is an agreement between answers. Like, for example, the phrase uses ijma. There's ijma, which is consensus amongst the scholars of Islam regarding many aspects. Like, for example, you will pray 5 times a day. You have to give zakat, alms, to the poor. You have to do certain procedures in order to ensure that your ghusl, your shower is verified, in order to ensure your income is halal, for example, to ensure to ensure that the society, the government, the military, and the entire social order is run properly. Right, so there's agreement to a very large degree. Of course, there are theological, philosophical aspects that are not agreed upon, but that's not the concern here. The agreement comes closer if the answers are subjected to scrutiny with a view to discarding those which proceed from unqualified witnesses. So now my question is naturally, who are these unqualified witnesses? Okay, and if you say, okay, the unqualified witness is him, now the question is, what is the criteria under which you have 3 things? Number 1, highlighted. Number 2, highlighted and researched. Number 2, examined, i.e. scrutinized. And number 3, disqualified. What is the criterion? There must be a criterion, because in Islam we have a criteria for the ahadith transmitters, and also as far as someone who is reciting the Quran. For example, the imam, the leader of the prayer in the mosque, he's reciting, he makes a minor mistake, there will be brothers at the back who will correct them, even on a single vowel or a single word or a sound even. So again, this idea of ensuring that from top to bottom and from bottom up, you are the right individual who's able to put forward and to be put forward so that you can run and proceed with this knowledge. Because the Quran is an oral tradition. Again, I'll give the example of the Quran. It's a tradition. It's an oral tradition. It's been passed down orally. Of course, it was compiled in book form, and that ensured that data is stored, because paper and ink was one of the most primordial sources of storing information. So, history, like theology or natural science, is a special form of thought. If that is so, questions about the nature, object, method, and value of this form of thought must be answered by persons having two qualifications. Wow, subhanallah. So I literally just asked the question, and now he's saying here are the two qualifications in order to understand the nature, object, method, and value of this form of thought. Who can say you're qualified, you're not? First, they must have experience of that form of thought. They must be historians. In a sense, we are all historians nowadays. All educated persons have gone through a process of education which has included a certain amount of historical thinking, which is again biased. But this does not qualify them to give an opinion about nature, object, method, and value of historical thinking. For in the first place, the experience of historical thinking, which they have thus acquired, is probably very superficial. But this does not qualify them to give an opinion on nature. But for in the first place, the experience of historical thinking which they have thus acquired is probably very superficial, and the opinions based on it are therefore no better grounded than a man's opinions of French people based on a single week visit to Paris. Yeah, I mean, again, this is what I mentioned way earlier in the video, in this lecture, which is you can't expect to study something like philosophy of history in just like 45 seconds to 2 minutes. That is very unfair, and unlike serious inquiry, casual inquiry can be it can be passed on. You know, you heard something, read something, passed it on to a friend, shared it on a social media group you're part of, post on your story, so on and so forth. However, once you scrutinize and see what's going on, then you're like, wow, hang on a second, there's much more to this. For example, I'll name a few things and then you can do your own research. Operation Cast Lead, the operation done by the colonizers on the colonized, and also Operation Paperclip, which proved to be economically and substantially beneficial, and to a very large degree advantageous for the Americans post World War II in terms of the scientists and the talent they got. Where did they get them from? Who were they? Operation Paperclip. And third thing I would say is MK Ultra. How even to this very second, using optogenetics and neuroscience, really being able to control the mind through light and sound and different media, and MK Ultra, the methodologies and the type of individuals involved, the organization that was involved, which organization, where from, what experiments did they do, what did it involve, who were part of these experiments, famous people and people who are not so known. Sidney Gottlieb, Stanley Milgram, you can read into yourself. In the second place, experience of anything, whatever gained through the ordinary educational channels as well as being superficial, is invariably out of date. Experience of historical thinking so gained is modeled on textbooks. And textbooks always describe not what is now being thought by real life historians, but what was thought about real life historians at some time in the past when the raw material was being created out of which the textbook has been put together. So the textbook is a thought of a thought. Thought of a thought. That's what it is. It's third hand, third stage data. This is what I was mentioning earlier. Just because, for example, your Imam on a Friday mentions something about Abdul Qadir Jilani, a Sufi who may or may not have been a deceptive character, but the type of stories associated with him, that is passed down through many hands and many doors and many avenues. It's imperative that you go and research the actual topic being discussed in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah. Same with Christianity. You probably want to look up Tertullian, I mentioned earlier, Origen, Philo of Alexandria, and his relation to the Pauline Gospels, and also looking at the philosophy of the Talmud, and looking at folks like Maimonides, and there was another Jewish philosopher I cannot remember at the moment, but also played a prominent role in history and philosophy, and to a large degree deception as well. And then you have John of Damascus, who was actually under the Umayyad Empire at some point. So it's extremely important to understand that once you come across a historian's opinion of history, you have to go to that history and then understand that historian. So, it's a whole science, really. And it's a fascinating area, to say the least. Anyway, where was I? Okay. And it is not only the result of historical thought, which are out of date by the time they get into the textbook, which is true. It is also the principles of historical thought, that is, the ideas as to the nature, object, method, and value of historical thinking. Okay. In the third place, and connected with this, there is a peculiar illusion incidental to all knowledge acquired in the way of education, the illusion of finality. When a student is in stato pupillari with respect to any subject whatever, he has to believe that things are settled because the textbooks and his teachers regard them as settled. When he emerges from the state and goes on studying the subject for himself, he finds that nothing is settled. Exactly my point, as I mentioned earlier. Nothing is really settled because there are always shifts in the paradigm, again, the values, the object-subject relationship, and the methodologies. And this very interesting framework that I would like to share at this point, although I wanted to share this in the Cohen video, but I'll share it right now. This is a framework I've been implementing in my life recently, and it's the AMPPT framework, which is approach, method, methodology, procedure, technique. Now, approach is the high level thinking you will come with, the direction in which you'll approach a problem, a challenge, an idea, or a project, right? M is the methodology, the set of steps you need. Method is one of those steps. And P is procedure, is the steps you need to take of the main step. And T is the technique. It's a action that you've done which can be quantified, i.e. measured, so that it can be qualitatively judged as being successful or not. So I came across that when reading about methodological directives in Kuhn's work, which we will inshallah touch on soon. Anyway, the dogmatism, which is an invariable mark of immaturity, drops away from him. He looks at so-called facts with a new eye. He says to himself, my teacher and textbooks told me that such and such thing was true. But is it true? What reasons had they for thinking it true, and were these reasons adequate? On the other hand, if he emerges from the status of pupil without continuing to pursue the subject, he never rids himself of this dogmatic attitude, and this makes him a person this makes him a person peculiarly unfitted to answer the questions I have mentioned. No one, for example, is likely to answer them worse than an Oxford philosopher who, having read greats in his youth, was once a student of history and thinks that this youthful experience of historical thinking entitles him to say what history is and what it is about and how it proceeds and what it is for. So this is criteria number 1. Interesting. Criteria number 2. Summarizing criteria number 1, don't be a casual, be a serious. Be a G in this thing. Number 2. The second qualification for answering these questions is that a man should not only have experience of historical thinking, but should also have reflected upon that experience. I have done business and unsuccessful, all of them so far, alhamdulillah. And they would have been successful if person X did it, or if I did it during time Y, or if I had the approach of Z. Irrespective, that is my experience, and it's my job now. Sometimes I have conflicting thoughts, again, which goes back to my previous statement I mentioned way before, probably towards the middle of this video, which is presence of mind is extremely important. Knowing when and how you are doing something and why you're doing something. That's why the AMPT framework has been very, very good for me. Has been great for me actually so far. So may Allah, inshallah, Allah keep us disciplined and hopeful and positive. Ameen. The second qualification for answering these questions is that a man should not only have experience of historical thinking, but should also have reflected upon that experience. He must be not only a historian, but a philosopher, and in particular his philosophical thought must have included special attention to the problems of historical thought. Now, it is possible to be a quite good historian, though not a historian of the highest order, without thus reflecting upon one's own historical thinking. It's possible to be a good historian without thus reflecting upon one's own historical thinking. Okay, I mean, I guess that would be a secondary candidate rather than a primary candidate, because I would want someone who is a philosopher and a historian, someone who's a G in both. It is even easier to be a good teacher of history, quite a good teacher of history, without such reflection. At the same time, it is important to remember that experience comes first, reflection comes second. Yep, that is true. Even the least reflective historian has the first qualification. He possesses the experience on which to reflect, and when he is asked to reflect on it, his reflections have a good chance of being to that point. An historian, it should be a historian, a historian who has never worked much at philosophy would probably answer our 4 questions in a more intelligent and valuable way than a philosopher who has never worked much at history. I shall therefore propound answers to my 4 questions, such as I think any present-day historian would accept. Here they will be rough and ready answers, but they will serve for a provisional definition, okay, of our subject matter, and they will be defended and elaborated as the argument proceeds. Okay, interesting. Let's see where this goes. Definition of history. Okay. Every historian would agree, I think, that history is a kind of research or inquiry. What kind of inquiry it is, I do not yet ask. The point is that generically it belongs to what we call the sciences, that is, the forms of thought whereby we ask questions and try to answer them. Science in general, it is important to realize, does not consist in collecting what we already know and arranging it in this or that kind of pattern. It consists in fastening upon something we do not know and trying to discover it. Playing patience with things we already know may be a useful means towards the end, but it is not the end itself. It is at best only the means. It is scientifically valuable insofar as the new arrangement gives us the answer to a question we have already decided to ask. That is why all science begins from the knowledge of our ignorance. I agree with that statement. Not our ignorance of everything, but our ignorance of some definite thing. The origin of Parliament, the cause of cancer, the chemical composition of the sun, the way to make a pump work without muscular exertion on the part of a man or a horse or some other docile animal. Science is finding things out, and in that sense, history is a science. Yeah, because it's relative to space and time, and these are not abstract things, although science has abstract preconditions, for sure. Right, the object of history. One science differs from another in that it finds out things at a different kind. What kind of things does history find out? I answer register. I answer register. Actions of human beings that have been done in the past. Although this answer raises all kinds of further questions, many of which are controversial still. However, they may be answered. The answers do not discredit the proposition that history is the science of res gestae. They attempt to answer questions about human actions done in the past. So, okay. Although this raises all kinds of further questions, many of which are controversial, however, they may be answered. The answers do not discredit the proposition that history is a science of register. They attempt to answer questions about human actions done in the past. How does history proceed? History proceeds by the interpretation of evidence. I am also working on another piece of content with Elliot Sober's theory on evolution, and he mentions evidence, and he speaks of evidence in reference to Royal wrote a book on evidence and statistical evidence in particular. So that is very key and very much overlooked, which is evidence these days. Of course, there are situations where there is a power play dynamic whereby, because an authority has said it, a politician or a news outlet or a social media or something, people just take it at face value. But you have to really study the evidence, and this is what the Quran encourages, is reflection, and constantly have that fikr, that thought of, okay, I need to understand and reflect. That's extremely important. Same with the hadith. We have to constantly see and understand the origin of the person who transmitted this, who they were, where they're from. Again, something I mentioned earlier as well. So, evidence. Where evidence is a collective name for things which singly are called documents, and document is a thing existing here and now of such a kind that the historian, by thinking about it, can get answers to the questions he asks about past events. Here again, there are plenty of difficult questions to ask as to what the characteristics of evidence are and how it is interpreted, but there is no need for us to raise them at this stage. However, they are answered. Historians will agree that historical procedure or method consists essentially of interpreting evidence. Lastly, what is history for? This is inshallah the last aspect of this video as well. What is history for? This is perhaps a harder question than the others. A man who answers it will have to reflect rather more widely than a man who answers the three we have answered already. You must reflect not only on historical thinking but on other things as well, because to say that something is for something implies a distinction between A and B, where A is good for something and B is that which something is good. A is good for something and B is that for which something is good. A is good for walking, is good for health, and protein is thing which walking is good. Okay, I understand. But I will suggest an answer and express the opinion that no historian would reject it, although the further questions to which it gives rise are numerous and difficult. My answer is that history is for human self-knowledge. It is generally thought to be of importance to man that he should know himself, where knowing himself means knowing not his merely personal peculiarities, the things that distinguish him from other men, but his nature as man. How do you know your nature of man? SubhanAllah, I can see many parallels from what Collingwood is writing about and the Quran. By Quran I mean the approach, direction. This is one of many directions. My answer is that history is for human self-knowledge. It is generally thought to be of importance to man that he should know himself, where knowing himself means knowing not his merely personal peculiarities, the things that distinguish him from other men, but his nature as a man. Knowing yourself means knowing first what it is to be a man. It's a good question. Secondly, knowing what it is to be the kind of man you are. Thirdly, knowing what it is to be the man you are and nobody else is. Knowing yourself means knowing first what it is to be a man. Secondly, knowing what it is to be a kind of man you are. Kind means, again, so many things that make up the man you are. Thirdly, knowing what it is to be the man you are and nobody else is. So it's further basically narrowing down. Knowing yourself means knowing what you can do, and since nobody knows what he can do until he tries, the only clue to what a man can do is what a man has done. Wow. To be fair, I have not done much, and I'm confident from this point onwards that will change, inshallah, bi-idhnillah. The value of history then is that it teaches us what man has done and thus what man is. That's the summary of history: what man has done and thus what man is. Idea of history, R.G. Collingwood, 20th century, philosophy of history. May Allah guide us to the truth. with a capital T, and may Allah help us recognize it and distinguish between falsehood and the truth. Ameen. La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min zalimeen. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.